It was a particularly dark night. The clouds had thickened over the city, the moon had disappeared, and only the light of lone street lamps shone through the dense fog. The phone in Maxford's office rang, breaking the silence. Picking up the receiver, the detective heard the familiar but strained voice of Captain Reed. "Maxford, we have a homicide. It's too weird. House on the cliff, victim Norman Crawford. I need you here now." Those words sounded like a wake-up call. Crawford was a famous lawyer, a man who knew too many powerful people's secrets. Maxford immediately threw on his shabby coat, checked his notebook and revolver, then headed for the scene. The drive to the house was long and anxious. The car was tearing through thick fog, and the headlights only dimly illuminated the winding road. The house on the cliff appeared before him suddenly, grim, massive, as if carved out of the rock itself. The waves of the ocean crashed against the rocks below, and the wind howled as if warning of coming dangers. Captain Reed met Maxford on the doorstep. His face looked tired, but his eyes were full of weariness. "What have we got?" the detective asked briefly. "The victim is dead." The door to the office was locked from the inside. The only key was in Crawford's hand. But the strangest thing is the phone call he managed to make before he died. He'd left a message, but the whole thing sounded crazy. Maxford nodded and stepped into the house. There was a disturbing silence inside. The house breathed of its dark past. The air smelled damp and dusty. Now the task was clear, to find out what had happened that fateful evening. The room where Crawford was found looked more like an intellectual battle arena. A massive oak desk held neatly laid out papers, pens, and a glass of half-drunk whiskey. A library filled with old tomes was visible behind the back of a chair. Maxford examined the body carefully. Crawford sat in the chair as if he had fallen asleep. But there was a thin red mark on his neck that spoke of strangulation. A broken glass lay on the floor nearby, and his hands still clutched the key. Captain Reed, standing behind him, watched the detective's work with a frown. "It's a little too perfect," Maxford said at last. "What do you mean?" Reed clarified. "It looks as if someone was trying to leave us with a perfect mystery." Maxford walked over to the only window in the room. It was closed, but when he touched the frame, he noticed a faint trace of dust, as if someone had recently tried to open it. The mechanism was rusted, however, and it was impossible to do so unnoticed. The door was locked from the inside, the windows too, Maxford muttered, looking around the room. But that didn't mean the killer couldn't have thought of something more clever. His attention was drawn to the phone on the desk. It was slightly moved to the side, and it seemed odd. "What did you think of the call?" Reed asked. "It's the key to everything. We need to find out exactly what he was trying to say," Maxford answered, feeling the puzzle begin to fit together. The call made by Crawford turned out to be recorded. Maxford listened to it several times. The victim's voice was agitated but clear. "They're coming after me. I have proof. It's about the files." After these words there was a thud, as if something had fallen, and then silence. Those phrases sounded like a cry for help. Who were these they? What evidence did Crawford have in mind? And where were these files? Maxford looked around the room once more. In a desk drawer he found a folder of papers. Most of them were related to court cases that Crawford had handled. However, there was one file among the papers that stood out from the rest. It was a handwritten note with 3 names on it. "What is it?" Reed asked, peering over Maxford's shoulder. "It's probably a list of people who might have threatened Crawford," the detective replied, looking through the names. "But you have to be careful. I have a feeling this is a trap. Every name on the list seemed familiar. They were influential figures in the city, a businessman, a politician, and a lawyer. Some of them are clearly involved, Maxfer said thoughtfully. But why? While Captain Reed studied the documents, the detective looked carefully at the phone. It seemed to him that Crawford's call was intended not only to warn, but to leave a trail that would help find the killer. We need to find out more about those names, he said, looking at the captain. And as soon as possible. The next morning, Maxfer went to the archives. He couldn't just rely on his intuition that 3 names on Crawford's list required a thorough check. The archive, as always, was saturated with the smell of old paper and a silence that was broken only by the rustling of pages. The names on the list began to take on context. The first was Edward Langley, a businessman whose company had been implicated in several major money laundering scandals. The second was Senator John Reeves, a man with a reputation as an impeccable politician, but whose ambitions were whispered to be based on threats and blackmail. The third name belonged to Carl Hoffman, a lawyer who had once worked alongside Crawford but who later parted ways after a bizarre lawsuit. Maxfer turned his attention to a case that connected all 3, a major lawsuit from 5 years ago. That case ended abruptly. Crawford dropped the charges despite the clear evidence against Hoffman. Why did he give up then? The detective pondered, holding up an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Crawford surprises everyone with unexpected move." Absorbed in thought, Maxfer didn't notice Captain Reed enter the file room. "We have news," he said, tossing a folder on the desk. The lab had reviewed the surveillance footage. A car had pulled up to the mansion the night before. The camera recorded that there were 2 people in it, but their faces were hidden. Maxfer frowned. "And the car?" "Registered to a front man. There's hardly any trace of it. But we do have video." The detective realized that now he had to put the pieces together. Langley, Reeves, Hoffman. One of them was clearly playing a bigger game than he realized. Maxfer decided to start with Edward Langley. The businessman was known for his audacity and his ability to avoid responsibility. His office was located in a skyscraper in the center of the city, the perfect symbol of power and wealth. Langley greeted Maxfer with a cold smile, sitting in a huge leather chair behind a glass desk. "Maxfer, what an honor to see you here." His voice was warm but overly strained. "Norman Crawford. He was murdered," the detective began, undistracted by politeness. Langley raised an eyebrow slightly, feigning surprise. "I'm sorry to hear that. But what does this have to do with me?" "I think you know," Maxfer replied, taking a list of names out of his pocket. "Why is your name connected with him? And what were you doing last night?" Langley grinned briefly. "Listen, detective. Norman and I. Yes, we've had affairs in the past. But if you think I'm involved, you're gonna have to find more than just a list." The conversation was tense, but Langley remained calm. Maxfer noticed that the businessman was trying to change the subject, avoiding direct answers. But there was concern in his eyes. Langley clearly knew more than he was saying. Leaving the office, the detective sensed that this conversation was only superficial. Langley was hiding something, but there was no proof. Next on the list was Senator John Reeves. The politician was known for his impeccable reputation, but Maxfer knew that every impeccable facade has its cracks. Reeves received the detective at his mansion. The senator's office resembled a museum, leather-bound books, paintings by famous artists, an expensive antique clock on the mantelpiece. "Detective Maxfer, to what do I owe the pleasure of your visit?" Reeves asked, adjusting his tie and casting an appraising glance. Norman Crawford has been murdered, Maxfer said without further preamble. His last call had been about evidence against several people, including you. The senator frowned, but quickly pulled himself together. That's ridiculous, he replied. Norman was a friend of mine. Yes, we had our differences, but nothing that could have led to his death. And yet your address is mentioned in his records, Maxfer insisted. What would you say about your possible presence in his house on the night of the murder? Reeves was silent for a moment, then grinned coldly. I was at the fundraiser. Hundreds of people can attest to that. His alibi sounded too smooth to be true. Maxfer noticed the senator's hand clenched slightly when he heard the question. It was a small thing, but the detective knew such details could reveal more than words could. As he left the mansion, Maxfer thought about it. Both Langley and Reeves had denied involvement, but both seemed too wary. Now there was a third name to check out, Carl Hoffman, the man who had once known Crawford best. Maxfer sat in his car in front of Carl Hoffman's house. The lawyer, known for his cunning and manipulation, lived modestly compared to Langley and Reeves. An old house with peeling paint, as if a symbol that under its roof hid not only secrets, but weaknesses as well. Maxfer rang the doorbell, and a minute later Hoffman himself opened it. His face was haggard, his eyes red, as if he had not slept for several nights. I knew you'd come, he said, inviting Maxfer inside. The living room was a mess, papers scattered, the desk cluttered with old files. A nearly empty bottle of whiskey stood on the floor. Did you know Crawford had been murdered? The detective asked bluntly. Of course, answered Hoffman, settling back in his chair. I knew it would happen sooner or later. He ruined himself. And who do you think did it? Maxfer looked intently at the lawyer. Hoffman laughed. Bitterly and nervously. You think I'm going to tell you the truth? Detective, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. These people, they'd do anything to hide their secrets. Maxfer sensed that Hoffman knew something but was afraid to say it. The detective decided to use strategy. I'm about to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Langley's lying. Reeves has built an alibi that's bursting at the seams. And you're the only one who seems to realize how deep this goes. Hoffman was silent. But then, suddenly, he pulled a letter from his pocket and held it out to Maxfer. It's from Crawford. He sent it the day before he died. I thought I could cover it up, but now, it's useless. The letter contained details of a scheme involving Langley, Reeves, and several other powerful figures. But what was most shocking was the last line. Carl, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. They know I'm coming to you. Take care of yourself. You're next. The letter changed everything. Maxfer realized that this wasn't just a murder, but part of a larger game that could affect many. He gathered all three of them, Langley, Reeves, and Hoffman, in one place, the precinct. They sat across from each other, each avoiding meeting each other's eyes. We're here because you three have secrets, Maxfer began. And those secrets led to Norman Crawford's death. Langley snorted. You're just trying to intimidate us. Don't try that, Langley, the detective interrupted. I have a letter that explains everything. Maxfer unfolded the sheet and read Crawford's lines. Langley's face went pale. Reeves remained motionless, but his hands clenched into fists. Hoffman lowered his head as if recognizing his powerlessness. Crawford knew the scheme in which all three were engaged. Money, blackmail, false accusations. He was going to expose you. And you, Reeves, were the one most afraid of losing your reputation. Reeves exploded. That's a lie. I didn't kill him. Then how do you explain the security video of your car parked outside Crawford's house? Maxfer asked coldly. Reeves fell silent. Langley fidgeted nervously in his seat. But Maxfer didn't stop. Langley, your company was providing the funding for this scheme. And you were afraid Crawford would expose it. Langley jumped up. Yes, I knew he was dangerous. But I didn't kill him. Maxfer paused for a moment before throwing one last trump card. And that's who did. He turned to Hoffman. It was you. Hoffman looked up slowly. Yes, he whispered. But not for his own sake. He would have ruined us all if he'd gotten those secrets out. You used their fear to hide your motive, Maxfer added. The room froze. The truth had come out. Maxfer felt a heavy weight fall from his shoulders, but the bitterness remained. The case was closed. But he knew that the real victims were those who had become pawns in this game. If you like this story, support me by subscribing to the channel. I'm putting in the effort for you, and your subscription helps me grow. Also, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion really matters to me.